The rain fell in sheets of liquid chrome, shearing the neon glow of the city into a million fractured pieces. It slicked the permacrete under his worn boots, each step a precarious gamble against gravity and exhaustion. He was a ghost in the machine of the lower district, a phantom woven from desperation and the acrid scent of ozone. The scent blockers chafed at his skin, a constant, abrasive reminder of what he was, what he was hiding. He was not an asset. He was not a number. He was Elian, and he was running. For 347 days, he had been a name, not a designation. He had learned the rhythm of a life unmonitored, the simple, profound pleasure of choosing his own food, of sleeping without the hum of surveillance equipment in the walls. He had almost forgotten the texture of the fear, the cold, smooth certainty of being hunted. Almost. A flicker of movement in a puddle's reflection, a silhouette detaching itself from the deep shadows of an archway, too sleek, too deliberate for a slum dweller. Elian's heart, a frantic bird in the cage of his ribs, slammed against the bone. His breath hitched, a plume of white vapor instantly devoured by the rain. He didn't look back. He just ran. The alleyways became a labyrinth, a maze of corroded metal and crumbling brick. The stench of decay and synthetic nutrients was thick in the air, a familiar perfume of the forgotten parts of the city. He vaulted a collapsed waste unit, his muscles screaming in protest, the burn in his lungs a wildfire. He was faster than most, a product of conditioning he could never fully erase. His body was a weapon he had tried to sheathe, but the training was etched into his marrow. He could feel the pursuit, not just hear the faint, disciplined echo of footsteps. It was a pressure in the air, a shift in the atmospheric density, a presence. It coiled around him, a predatory stillness that belied the speed of the chase. It was a scent, faint but unmistakable, breaking through the city's olfactory chaos and the failing chemical barrier on his skin. Sandalwood and cold steel, a scent he associated with sterile white rooms and a low, calm voice that could dissect his every thought. A scent he had once equated with a strange, distorted form of safety. Betrayal tasted like metal in his mouth. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The figure was closer now, a tall, imposing shape cutting through the downpour with an unnatural grace. The Alpha. Not just any Alpha. Him. The confirmation was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs more effectively than the exertion. He pushed harder, fueled by a fresh wave of panic that was colder and sharper than the rain. He was a cornered animal. Instinct overriding reason. He saw an opening, a narrow gap between a humming generator and a graffiti-scarred wall. Freedom was a sliver of darkness on the other side. He lunged for it. He was almost there. The air behind him solidified. The pressure intensified, a wave of pure, unadulterated dominance that washed over him, that sought to drown him. And then, the voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was a command, forged in the very core of his pursuer's being, honed into a weapon of absolute authority. It sliced through the roar of the rain, through the frantic drumming of his own pulse, and struck the base of his spine. Stop. It was not a request. It was a law of physics. Alien's body obeyed before his mind could even process the rebellion. His legs locked. His forward momentum died, his boots skidding on the wet ground. He froze, muscles rigid, every fiber of his being screaming to move, to flee, to fight. But he couldn't. He was paralyzed, pinned in place by two syllables. The Omega in him, the part he had starved and suppressed and poisoned with chemicals, bowed its head in instinctual, absolute submission. He stood, trembling, his back to the hunter, the rain plastering his thin shirt to his skin. He could hear the footsteps now, slow, deliberate, each one a hammer blow against the anvil of his hope. They stopped directly behind him. He could feel the heat radiating from the alpha's body, a stark contrast to the chill of the night. The scent of sandalwood and steel was overwhelming, a suffocating blanket that stripped away his defenses, peeling back the layers of his carefully constructed anonymity until he was raw and exposed. He was Subject 734 again. He was an asset, an experiment, a failure. A hand, large and firm, settled on his shoulder. The touch was not violent, yet it sent a tremor of pure terror through him. It was a touch of ownership, a claim being reasserted. "Elian," the voice said, closer now, a low murmur by his ear that was somehow more terrifying than the command. The use of his chosen name was the final, cruelest twist of the knife. It was an acknowledgement of the person he had tried to become, used as a tool to drag him back to the thing he had been. The hand on his shoulder tightened, a silent, inescapable punctuation. The hunt was over. The transport was a void, a silent, sterile pod devoid of light, sound, and sensation. It was a deliberate sensory deprivation, a tool used to unmoor a subject from their sense of self, to make them pliable. Elian had spent countless hours in these pods during his conditioning. He knew the protocol. He knew the intended effect. But this time, it was different. This time, he had memories of the outside to cling to. The memory of sunlight warming his face, a sensation so alien and miraculous he had almost wept the first time. The taste of real food, unprocessed and imperfect. The sound of music played on a scavenged acoustic instrument by a woman in the market, her voice rough but full of a life he had never known. He held on to these fragments, these shards of a stolen year, using them as an anchor against the encroaching emptiness. They were his. They could take his body, lock him away, but they could not erase the feeling of the sun on his skin. He focused on his breathing, the slow, measured rhythm Kalen had taught him. In through the nose, hold for 4, out through the mouth. The irony was a bitter pill. The very techniques he had been taught to control his volatile empathic abilities were now the only thing keeping his panic at bay. And the man who had taught him was the one who had thrown him back into the dark. Kalen. The name was a wound. For years, Kalen had been his entire world. His handler, his trainer, his warden. The only constant presence in a life of sterile white rooms and painful procedures. He had been the calm anchor in Elian's emotional storms, his low voice a steady metronome against the cacophony of other people's feelings that bled into Elian's mind. There had been a connection, a bond forged in the crucible of the program, a sync. It was a resonant frequency between their minds, a side effect of the training that the researchers had found fascinating and Kalen had treated with a quiet, professional gravity. Through that sync, Elian had felt glimpses of the man beneath the uniform, a profound loneliness, a weariness that seemed bone deep, a tightly coiled discipline that was its own kind of cage. He had mistaken it for something akin to care. He had been a fool. The pod hissed, and a sliver of light pierced the darkness. The door slid open, revealing not the harsh, clinical glare of the facility, but the muted, ambient light of a private chamber. It was larger than his old cell, furnished with a severe, minimalist aesthetic. A bed, a small table, a chair. The walls were a soft, matte grey that seemed to absorb sound. A cage, but a more comfortable one. Kalen stood just outside the doorway, his posture rigid, his face an impassive mask. He wore the same dark, high-collared uniform of the authorities' reclamation division, a stark contrast to the softer training clothes Elian remembered. The scent of him, sandalwood and cold steel, filled the space, and Elian's suppressed instincts recoiled. It was the scent of a cage door slamming shut. "You will be quartered here," Kalen stated, his tone flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a stranger. "Your vitals will be monitored. A nutrient dispenser is integrated into the wall. You will be provided with sanitation cycles twice daily." Elian remained silent, his gaze fixed on a point just past Kalen's shoulder. To look at him was to acknowledge the betrayal, and he wasn't ready. He couldn't bear it. He wrapped his arms around himself, a subconscious gesture of self-protection. Why? The word was a croak, torn from his throat. It was the only question that mattered. Kalen's expression didn't flicker, but Elian, even without the full strength of their sync, felt a tremor in the man's composure. It was a flicker of something dark and complex, quickly suppressed. "You are an asset of the consortium," Kalen replied, the words a rote recitation. "A valuable and unstable one. Your unauthorized departure constituted a security risk." "I was a prisoner," Elian shot back, his voice gaining a raw edge. "I was a lab rat. You know what they did to me. What we did." The use of "we" was deliberate, a shard of glass aimed at the man who had held his hand through the worst of the psychic resonance procedures, who had murmured calming words as they pushed Elian's empathy to the breaking point. Kalen's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "The program has protocols. You were aware of them." Was this part of the protocol, Kalen? Hunting me down in some rain-soaked alley? Was it in my file that I liked the taste of synth noodles from the stall on Sector Gamma 9? Did you know that I learned to sleep through the night without the sedatives they used to pump into me? Each word was a desperate attempt to prove he had become a person, not just a project, to force Kalen to see the man he had captured. Kalen took a step into the room, the door sliding shut behind him with a soft, final thud. The space, which had seemed large, suddenly felt suffocatingly small. He was a predator in an enclosure with his prey. "The data from your time outside the facility is irrelevant," he said, his voice dropping lower. "What is relevant is your current state. Your empathic resonance is erratic. Your scent is unsuppressed. You are a danger to yourself and to the operational security of this city." He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a danger. The words were clinical, detached, but beneath them, Elian felt the faint, ghosting touch of the sync, a flicker of Kalen's true emotional state. It wasn't anger. It wasn't satisfaction. It was anxiety, a deep, controlled current of it, laced with something that felt disturbingly like guilt. The discovery didn't comfort him. It enraged him. It was an indulgence Kalen didn't deserve to feel. "Leave me alone," Elian whispered, turning away to face the grey wall. It was a dismissal, a desperate attempt to reclaim some sliver of control. He felt Kalen hesitate. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken history. For a moment, Elian thought he might say something else, something real. But the moment passed. The discipline reasserted itself. "Recalibration will begin at 0600, Kalen said, his voice once again the flat, official tone of a warden. The door hissed open and then shut again. Elian was alone. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the cold floor, pulling his knees to his chest. The ghost of Kalen's scent lingered in the air, a phantom limb of their shared past. Recalibration. He knew what that meant. They would strip away the year of freedom. They would dismantle the person he had built. They would force him back into the mold of Subject 734, the perfect empath, the silent weapon. And the man who had once been his only anchor would be the one holding the hammer. The recalibration chamber was a perfect sphere of white. The light was uniform, without source or shadow, designed to induce disorientation. Elian stood in the center, clad in a simple fiber-optic-laced tunic that monitored his every physiological response. He kept his eyes focused on the barely visible seam of the door, a thin grey line in the seamless white, grounding himself in its imperfection. Kalen stood in the observation booth, a dark silhouette behind the one-way mirrored glass. Elian couldn't see him, but he could feel him. The sink, dormant and frayed, flickered to life in this controlled environment, a faint hum at the edge of his consciousness. It was a tether he both hated and clung to. A disembodied, synthesized voice echoed in the chamber. Subject 734, Session 1. Cognitive and Empathic Baseline Assessment. Begin. The white walls around him dissolved into a cascade of images, sounds, and raw, unfiltered emotion. It was a psychic assault, a flood of simulated data designed to test the limits of his control. A screaming child's terror, a soldier's dying moments of regret, the euphoric joy of a first kiss, the crushing despair of a loved one's betrayal. It all washed over him, through him, a tsunami of feeling that threatened to obliterate his own identity. He had been trained for this. He closed his eyes, retreating into the mental fortress Kalen had helped him build. He found his center, the quiet, still point of his own consciousness, and began to compartmentalize the incoming data. He sorted the emotions, tagged them, filed them away without letting them take root. Terror in this box, joy in this one, grief over here. It was a clinical, dissociative process. He was a machine processing data. That was what they wanted. He could feel Kalen's attention through the sink, a focused, analytical beam. It wasn't the steady, supportive presence from their training sessions. It was the detached observation of a scientist studying a specimen. Elian pushed back, not with a psychic attack, but with a single, targeted memory. He projected it across their fragile link, the memory of a training session, years ago. He had been struggling, overwhelmed by a particularly violent simulation. He had collapsed, hyperventilating, the phantom pain of a dozen simulated deaths racking his small frame. Kalen had broken protocol. He had entered the chamber, knelt beside him, and placed a hand on his back. He hadn't spoken. He had just projected a feeling of pure, unshakable calm, a silent, solid anchor in the storm. Breathe with me, 734. Just breathe. The memory, sharp and vivid, hit the observation booth. Through the sink, Elian felt a jolt in Kalen's composure, a crack in the ice, a flicker of warmth, instantly extinguished. Kalen stood behind the console, his knuckles white where he gripped its edge. The memory had blindsided him. He remembered the boy, small and trembling, his empathic abilities a raw, open wound. He remembered the instinctive, unprofessional urge to comfort him. He had logged the incident as a tactile grounding exercise, a sanitized lie to satisfy the overseers. But it had been more. It had been the moment their sync had truly solidified, the moment he had realized the dangerous depth of their connection. He was a fool for thinking he could sever it so cleanly. He watched the readouts on his screen. Elian's vitals were stable. His brainwave patterns showed immense strain, but also perfect control. He was executing the compartmentalization technique flawlessly. He was the program's greatest success and its most profound failure. Increase stimulus intensity to level 4, Kalen ordered, his voice clipped. The synthesized voice in the sphere complied. The flood of emotional data intensified, becoming a raging torrent. Elian gasped, his mental walls beginning to buckle. The sheer volume was too much. The lines between the simulated emotions and his own began to blur. He felt the phantom agony of a burn victim, the suffocating panic of drowning, the dizzying madness of a mind lost to psychosis. He was losing himself. "Stop," he choked out, the words swallowed by the sensory onslaught. "Please." In the booth, Kalen watched Elian's vitals spike into the red. Protocol dictated he continue until the subject lost consciousness, to establish a failure threshold. But he saw the boy from his memory, trembling on the floor. He saw the man in the rain, his eyes wide with a terror that was not simulated. "Cease the simulation," Kalen commanded, overriding the automated program. The images vanished, the sound cut out. The chamber was once again a silent, seamless sphere of white. Elian swayed on his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was still processing the psychic residue, the emotional echoes that clung to him like burrs. He looked toward the mirrored glass, though he couldn't see through it. "Why did you stop?" he asked, his voice shaking but clear. Kalen didn't answer. He couldn't. To admit it was pity, or worse, empathy, would be a confession of his own compromise. He was the handler, the warden. His feelings were irrelevant. "The baseline has been established," he said, his voice a cold, mechanical thing broadcast into the chamber. Session concluded. He turned and left the observation booth before Elian could say another word, before the ghost of that shared memory could fully unmake him. As he walked down the sterile corridor, the scent of sandalwood and steel felt like the scent of his own prison. He was not just the warden of Elian's cage. He was a prisoner in his own, a cage built of duty, discipline, and a past he could no more escape than the Omega he had just broken. He was an asset. He was an instrument of the consortium. He was not allowed to feel. But as he passed a polished chrome panel on the wall, he caught his own reflection, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, he saw the same haunted look in his own eyes that he had seen in Elian's. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of white rooms and grey silences. The recalibration sessions continued, each one a systematic attempt to dismantle Elian's psyche. They used sonic frequencies to induce fear, holographic projections of his deepest insecurities, and controlled releases of pheromones to trigger instinctual, submissive responses. Through it all, Kalen was a constant, silent presence behind the glass, his focus a palpable weight. Elian learned to weaponize their connection. He couldn't fight the machines, but he could fight the man operating them. During a memory regression sequence where they forced him to relive the trauma of his initial abduction from the unregistered settlements, he didn't scream or fight. Instead, he focused every ounce of his energy on the sync, and he shared. He didn't just broadcast the memory. He broadcast the pure, undiluted terror of a child being ripped from his family, the smell of burning shelters, the cold grip of armored hands. He forced Kalen to feel it with him. In the observation booth, Kalen stumbled back from the console, a hand flying to his chest. The shared agony was a physical blow. His own memories, long suppressed, threatened to surface. A burning village, a different time, the same cold grip of the authority. He was a boy, too, once. One they had taken and forged into a tool. He slammed a mental wall down, severing the connection, his breath coming in harsh, controlled gasps. He was losing control. The subject was influencing the handler. It was the ultimate failure. That night, Kalen bypassed protocol. Long after the facility's staff had retired to their quarters, he went to Elian's cell. The door hissed open, and Elian, who had been lying on his cot staring at the ceiling, sat up. His eyes, dark and weary, held a spark of defiance. "Come to see the results of your work?" Elian asked, his voice rough. Kalen didn't answer. He walked to the nutrient dispenser and keyed in a sequence. A small, steaming cup emerged. He placed it on the table. "It's tea," he said, his voice low. "Real leaf, from off-world." Elian stared at the cup as if it were a bomb. In the facility, everything was synthetic, optimized, sterile. Real tea was a contraband luxury, an organic imperfection. It was an act of profound rule-breaking. "Why?" Elian whispered. Kalen stood by the table, his tall frame seeming to crowd the small room. "The regression sequence. It was inefficient. Your physiological stress levels exceeded projected parameters. It can lead to cellular degradation." It was a clinical, detached explanation for a deeply human act. A lie to cover an apology. He couldn't speak. Elian looked from the cup to Kalen's face. In the cell's soft light, the impassive mask seemed to have slipped. He could see the exhaustion etched around the alpha's eyes, the tension in his jaw. He could feel it too, a low thrum of conflict, of something cracking and under immense pressure. "You felt it, didn't you?" Elian said, his voice losing its hard edge. "What they did to me, to my family." Kalen's gaze fell to the floor. "My experiences are not relevant to your recalibration." "Aren't they?" Elian pressed, standing up and taking a step closer. The air between them crackled. "They took you too. I've seen it. In the sink. Little flashes. You're just like me, Kalen. A different cage, maybe a bigger one, but you're still their property." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and true. Kalen was a product of the Alpha Enhancement Program, taken as a promising youth and molded into the perfect enforcer. His emotions were liabilities to be controlled, his instincts tools to be weaponized. He was the mirror image of Elian's own conditioning. "Your assumptions are incorrect," Kalen said, but the words lacked their usual conviction. His scent, usually so controlled, shifted. A note of something raw and uncertain bled through the sandalwood and steel. Elian reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them. A reckless, impulsive gesture. He didn't touch him. He just let his own scent, the scent of rain-soaked earth and a fragile, wild herbiness, bloom into the air, unfiltered by suppressants. It was an offering, an act of vulnerability, a question. Kalen's breath hitched. The scent was grounding. It wasn't the cloying, desperate scent of a terrified Omega. It was defiant. It was alive. It cut through the sterile air of the facility and reminded him of something he had long forgotten. For a long, silent moment, they stood there, two prisoners in a cell, the Alpha and the Omega, the handler and the asset. The rigid lines of their roles blurred, dissolved by a shared history of trauma and a connection that defied protocol. Kalen's hand clenched into a fist at his side. He took a half-step back, the discipline reasserting itself like a reflex. The mask slipped back into place. "Finish the tea," he said, his voice once again flat and remote. "It has calming properties that will facilitate a more productive session tomorrow." He turned and left, the door sealing behind him. Ilian sank onto his cot, his body trembling. He hadn't been rebuffed. He knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in his bones, that he had broken through. He had reached the man inside the soldier. He picked up the cup. The warmth seeped into his cold hands. He brought it to his lips and inhaled the fragrant steam. It smelled of earth. It smelled of a world outside these walls. It smelled, faintly, of hope. And in his own solitary quarters, Kalen stood in the darkness, his back pressed against the cold wall, fighting for control. The scent of Ilian, of rain and wild things, clung to his uniform, a ghost of a freedom he hadn't realized he'd lost until that very moment. The cracks in his foundation were spreading. The incident with the tea had consequences. It was a deviation, an anomaly, and the consortium's system did not tolerate anomalies. The next morning, Kalen was summoned not to the observation booth, but to the office of the facility administrator. The administrator was a man who seemed to have no scent at all, a void in the olfactory landscape, which was more unsettling than any display of dominance. His office was a stark black space, overlooking the training yards from a sheet of polarized plasteel. He sat behind a large, empty desk, his hands steepled, his face a canvas of placid control. Warden Kalen, the administrator, began, his voice as smooth and sterile as the room. "There was an unscheduled entry into Subject 734's containment cell last night. Your unique biometric signature was logged." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Kalen stood at attention, his gaze fixed on the wall behind the administrator's head. "I was conducting a supplemental assessment of the subject's psychological state post-trauma regression. His distress was unusual. Unusual distress is the goal of that particular protocol," the administrator countered mildly. "It destabilizes aberrant personality constructs, and yet you terminated the session prematurely yesterday as well. You seem to be developing a pattern of inefficiency." The word hung in the air, a veiled threat. In the consortium, inefficiency was a disease, and it was excised without sentiment. "The subject's empathic abilities are volatile," Kalen explained, his tone even. "Pushing him to a full psychological break would risk permanent damage to the asset. My actions were to preserve the consortium's investment." The administrator smiled, a thin, bloodless gesture. "Ah, yes, the investment. Subject 734 is the culmination of decades of research, a perfectly receptive empath, capable of being tuned to any frequency, a living key that can unlock any mind. And you, Warden, were designed to be his perfect handler. Your alpha profile, your psychological conditioning, your specific genetic markers were all chosen to create the ideal resonant sync with him. You are two halves of a single, elegant weapon." The revelation settled over Kalen with the weight of a shroud. He had always known he was conditioned, but he had believed he was a soldier, a tool of his own making. To learn that his very being, his DNA, had been selected to pair with a specific Omega. It stripped him of the last vestiges of his autonomy. He was not a handler. He was a component. "The subject's escape was a setback," the administrator continued, his voice dropping slightly. His exposure to the outside world, to uncontrolled emotional stimuli, has introduced variables. It has corrupted his baseline. This alien persona is a virus that must be purged. Your sentimentality is hindering that process. He leaned forward, his eyes cold and dark. You are to proceed with the final phase of recalibration, the persona matrix wipe. You will oversee it personally. You will hold the anchor for his consciousness as the aberrant memories are excised. His bond with you is the key. Use it. Erase the name Alien and return subject 734 to us. Is that understood? A persona matrix wipe. It was a procedure Kalen had only read about in high-clearance files, a form of psychic surgery, brutal and irreversible. It would destroy the person Elian had become, leaving only the conditioned, obedient empath. It would leave a shell, a tool, responsive only to its handler, to him. He would be the warden of an empty soul. Yes, Administrator, Kalen said, the words tasting like ash. His duty and his conditioning screamed at him to obey. It was the logical, necessary course of action, but the memory of a warm cup of tea, of a defiant, vulnerable scent, of a shared, stolen moment of humanity in a cold cell, rebelled. The two halves of the weapon were beginning to aim at the system that had forged them. He left the office and walked the sterile corridors, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting directives. He passed a medical bay and saw Dr. Aris, a quiet, observant beta who had been with the program for years. She met his eyes for a moment, and in her gaze he saw not the usual professional deference, but a flicker of something else. Concern, pity. It was a crack in the facade of the facility itself. The system was not as monolithic as it appeared. He went to the recalibration chamber, but he did not enter the observation booth. He went to the preparation room where Elian was being held before the procedure. Elian looked up as he entered, his face pale but his eyes clear. He knew what was coming. The fear was a sharp, clean scent in the air, but it was layered over a bedrock of resolve. They're going to erase me, aren't they? Elian said, his voice quiet. Kalen nodded slowly, the motion feeling heavy, unnatural. That is the order. Elian held his gaze, and the sync between them, no longer a weapon or a tool, became a conduit for a silent, desperate plea. Don't let them. Kalen looked at the Omega before him. Not subject 734. Not an asset. Elian, a man who had tasted freedom and was being dragged back to a living death. He thought of the administrator's words of being a component, a pre-selected key for Elian's lock. The consortium hadn't just built a weapon, they had built a bond, and in their arrogance, they assumed they could control it. They had miscalculated. The bond was not a chain, it was a fuse. The procedure requires a direct neural interface, Kalen said, his voice low and steady, each word a carefully chosen brick in a new foundation. It will link me to you, to stabilize you. It will also provide me with temporary, limited access to the facility's internal network. Elian's eyes widened slightly as he understood the implication. Access. They will be monitoring our biometrics, Kalen continued, his gaze intense. But they will be focused on you. They will expect your resistance. They will not be watching me. The plan was insane. It was suicide. But the alternative, the slow, soul-crushing death of obedience, was no longer an option. When I establish the link, Kalen said, they will initiate the wipe sequence. There will be a surge of energy, a moment of systemic vulnerability. In that moment, be ready to run. The final chamber was colder than the others, the air humming with the energy of the persona matrix. Elian was strapped to a raised platform, a metallic halo lined with neural sensors lowered around his head. He was a sacrifice on a sterile altar. He met Kalen's eyes across the room as the Alpha was fitted with a similar, though less invasive, interface. There was no fear in Elian's gaze now, only a terrifying, resolute trust. He was placing the shattered fragments of his identity into the hands of his captor, his tormentor, his only hope. Kalen gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a promise. "Initiate neural link," the administrator's voice commanded from an unseen speaker. A jolt of energy, cold and electric, shot through Elian. The world dissolved. He was no longer in the chamber, but adrift in a sea of pure data, the architecture of his own mind laid bare. Memories glowed like constellations, the scent of his mother's baking, the rough bark of a tree he used to climb, the face of the woman who sold him noodles, the terror of the chase in the rain, and woven through it all, the constant grounding presence of Kalen. Then Kalen's consciousness entered his, not as an invader, but as a shield. The sink flared to its full, incandescent potential. For the first time, there were no walls, no secrets. Elian felt the full weight of Kalen's life, the brutal conditioning, the crushing loneliness, the rigid discipline that was a cry for control in a life that had never been his own. He felt Kalen's self-loathing, his guilt, and the fierce protective instinct that had finally broken through it all. He was not a monster. He was a man in a cage, just like him. "I am with you," Kalen's thoughts echoed in his mind, a silent vow. "Hold on." "Link established," a technician's voice reported. "Subject's neural architecture is mapped, ready for matrix wipe." "Begin," the administrator ordered, his voice laced with triumph. A new presence entered Elian's mindscape. It was a corrosive, alien force, a program designed to burn away everything that made him Elian. It appeared as a wave of black fire, consuming the constellations of his memories. He screamed, a silent, psychic shriek of agony. Now Kalen felt the wipe sequence begin, a brutal intrusion that threatened to scour them both. As the system focused all its power on overwhelming Elian's mind, Kalen acted. Using the access granted by the neural link, he plunged into the facility's network. It was a fortress of firewalls and encryption, but the link to Elian was a master key, a system-level vulnerability the designers had never anticipated. He wasn't a hacker. He was a ghost in their machine. He found the containment protocols, cell doors, security lockdowns, internal defenses. With a surge of will, he sent a single, cascading command. Unlock. All. Simultaneously, he accessed the central power grid. He didn't try to shut it down. He overloaded it. He pushed every watt of the facility's energy into the persona matrix, the very machine they were using to destroy Elian. In the physical world, alarms blared, a cacophony of shrieking sirens. Red emergency lights bathed the sterile corridors in a bloody glow. The persona matrix whined, the sound rising in pitch to an unbearable scream as it absorbed the power surge. Sparks erupted from control panels. The administrator's voice, now sharp with alarm, yelled, "What's happening? Shut it down." The black fire in Elian's mind faltered as its power source became unstable. "Elian, you have to fight it," Kalen projected, his own consciousness straining under the effort of holding back the wipe sequence and manipulating the network. Elian latched onto the anchor of Kalen's presence. He stopped running from the fire. He turned to face it. The consortium wanted an empath. He would give them one. He opened himself up completely, not just to his own pain, but to the pain of everyone the facility had ever broken. He gathered every echo of suffering that stained its walls, every ghost of a life they had erased, and he focused it into a single, piercing, psychic scream. He aimed it back down the neural link, past Kalen, directly at the minds of the operators, at the administrator. In the control room, men and women collapsed at their stations, clutching their heads, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of pure, distilled agony. The administrator staggered back from the main console, his nose bleeding, his placid expression shattered into one of raw terror. The machine exploded. A wave of concussive force and electrical discharge blew the chamber doors off their hinges. The neural halos shattered, freeing Elian and Kalen. The room was plunged into darkness, punctuated by the pulsing red of the emergency lights. Shrapnel littered the floor. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt wiring. Kalen was on his feet in an instant, pulling Elian from the wrecked platform. "Are you hurt?" "I'm whole," Elian breathed, the words full of awe. He could feel himself, all of himself, the name, the memories, the love, the pain. It was all there. He was not erased. Alarms continued to scream. Shouted commands echoed in the corridors. They had seconds. "This way," Kalen said, his voice the calm center of the chaos. He pulled Elian toward a service hatch he had unlocked, his grip on Elian's arm firm and steady. As they ran through the darkened, chaotic corridors, they passed Dr. Aris. She stood by an open supply closet, a data chip in her hand, which she pressed into Kalen's palm without a word. She had rerouted the security patrols, giving them a precious window. A small, quiet act of rebellion. They didn't stop to thank her. A shared look was enough. They were a handful of cracks, threatening to shatter the entire structure. They were almost to the outer perimeter when a figure blocked their path. The administrator, his face streaked with blood, a plasma pistol in his hand. "Impressive," he spat, his voice a raw rasp. "You turned the weapon against its masters, but the weapon still belongs to us." He raised the pistol, aiming it at Elian. An asset that cannot be controlled must be liquidated. Kalen moved without thinking. He pushed Elian behind him, shielding him with his own body. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't drop into a defensive stance. He simply stood before the administrator, the perfect soldier he had been trained to be, and spoke. His voice was not a shout. It was the same low, resonant tone he had used in the alley. It was pure alpha command, honed to a razor's edge, but this time it was not a tool of capture. It was a shield of defiance. "Drop it." The administrator flinched. His arm trembled. He was an alpha himself, but a political one, not a conditioned warrior like Kalen. The command hit him like a physical force, preying on a primal instinct he thought he had mastered. For a heartbeat, he faltered. It was all the time Elian needed. He reached out, not with a scream of pain, but with a whisper of empathy. He didn't show the administrator agony. He showed him Kalen's loyalty. He showed him his own desperate love for a life he had barely tasted. He showed him the quiet courage of Dr. Aris. He showed him all the small human emotions the consortium sought to erase. A flood of connection, of hope, of defiance. The administrator cried out, dropping the pistol as if it were burning hot. He wasn't just attacked. He was understood. And to a man like him, to be so utterly seen and comprehended by his own experiment was the ultimate violation. They didn't wait to see more. They ran past him, through the final blast door, and out into the cold, clean air of the night. They were free. The silence that followed the chaos was a physical presence. They had escaped the city's glowing superstructure, trading its sterile hum for the whisper of wind through the skeletal remains of pre-consortium architecture. They found shelter in the hollowed-out shell of an old library, a place of ghosts and decaying paper. The air smelled of dust and damp earth, a scent so organic, so real, it was almost overwhelming after the recycled air of the facility. Elian sat on a pile of rubble, his body trembling with reaction. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the phantom ache of the neural interface. He was free, but the word felt too large, too abstract. Freedom was not an event. It was a process, and he was only at the beginning. Kalen stood by a gaping hole in the wall that might have once been a window, his silhouette stark against the bruised twilight of the sky. He was scanning the horizon, his posture still that of a soldier on watch. The conditioning ran deep. He held the data chip Dr. Aris had given him. It contained everything. The program's research, the illegal procedures, the list of subjects, the genetic profiles of the handlers. It was proof. It was a weapon they could use to expose the consortium, to tear it down from the outside. But it was also a target. As long as they had it, they would be hunted. "Are you all right?" Kalen's voice was low, cutting through the quiet. Elian looked at the broad, rigid line of the Alpha's back. For years, that posture had meant authority, danger, confinement. Now, it had meant protection. The shift in perspective was dizzying. "I don't know what I am," Elian answered honestly. "I feel loud, everything inside me. The memories they try to take are all jumbled up with yours." The final, desperate sink in the matrix chamber had left an imprint. He could still feel the echoes of Kalen's life, the sting of the discipline rod, the isolation of the barracks, the quiet desperation of a man who had never been allowed a choice. Kalen turned from the window, his face shadowed. "It will fade. The connection will stabilize." He said it like a diagnosis, his clinical tone a shield against the intimacy of what they had shared. He walked over to Elian, his movements deliberate, and crouched down in front of him. For the first time, they were equals, eye to eye. "What they did to us," Kalen said, his voice losing its harsh edge, "was designed to make us tools. What they failed to understand is that you cannot forge a bond without creating a connection. They made us a weapon, Elian, but they aimed it at themselves." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently touched Elian's temple, where the phantom ache of the neural halo was strongest. His touch was warm, solid. It was not the touch of a handler, but of an equal, a partner. "They didn't erase you," Kalen murmured. "They showed you how strong you are." Elian leaned into the touch, a wave of emotion so powerful it stole his breath. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a profound, aching recognition. He saw the boy Kalen had been, and the man he had been forced to become, and the man he was choosing to be now, in the ruins of their old lives. He lifted his own hand, his fingers tracing the sharp line of Kalen's jaw. The Alpha didn't flinch. He closed his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability that was more profound than any spoken confession. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of everything that had happened and the terrifying uncertainty of what was to come. They were two fugitives, two broken products of a system they now sought to destroy. They had nothing but each other and a dangerous piece of data. "What do we do now?" Elian whispered. Kalen opened his eyes. The haunted look was still there, but it was tempered by a new, fierce resolve. "Now," he said, his hand sliding from Elian's temple to cup the back of his neck, a gesture of profound, protective tenderness. "We learn to live. And then, we fight back." He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. He leaned in, and the scent of sandalwood and cold steel, once a symbol of his control, now mingled with Elian's scent of rain and wild earth. It was no longer the scent of a prison. It was the scent of a promise, a new beginning, forged in fire and rebellion, in the quiet, shared space between two souls who had been caged and who had chosen, together, to be free. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, visible through the shattered roof of the library, Elian felt a flicker of something he had only ever experienced in simulations. Hope, real, fragile, and fierce. And it was enough. They traveled by night, ghosts in the skeletal framework of the world the consortium had paved over. Kalen navigated the dead zones and forgotten transit lines with an ingrained knowledge that spoke of a past he never discussed. He taught Elian how to move without a sound, how to read the subtle shifts in the wind that signaled a patrol drone, how to find clean water in the contaminated ruins. He was teaching Elian to survive, but it felt like an apology, a penance for the artificial world he had once forced Elian to inhabit. Elian, in turn, began to explore the vast, untamed landscape of his own abilities. Without the suppressants and the sterile dampening fields of the facility, his empathy was a living thing, a vibrant, chaotic sense that connected him to the world. He could feel the timid life of moss growing in the cracks of permacrete, the weary exhaustion of a stray animal, the distant collective anxiety of the city they had left behind. At first, it was overwhelming, a constant barrage of sensation that left him dizzy and nauseous. Kalen would find him curled in on himself, hands pressed to his temples, and would sit beside him, not speaking, but projecting that familiar, solid calm across their lingering sink. He became Elian's anchor again, but this time it was a choice, a quiet offering of support, not a function of control. One night, they took shelter in the rusted husk of an ancient freighter, beached and forgotten on the shore of a sludge-grey sea. The air was heavy with salt and chemical decay. Elian sat watching the oily waves lap against the shore, feeling the deep, slow, mindless pulse of the ocean. "I never knew," Elian said softly, his voice barely carrying over the waves. "In the facility, they showed me simulations of the ocean. They gave me the data, the chemical composition, the physics of the tides. But they never gave me this, the feeling of it, the sheer size." Kalen came to stand beside him, his gaze on the dark horizon. "They believe information is a substitute for experience. That control is a substitute for understanding. It is their fundamental flaw." "Is that what you believed?" Elian asked, the question direct, without accusation. Kalen was silent for a long time, the rhythmic crash of waves filling the space between them. "I believed in the integrity of the system," he finally said, his voice rough with a truth he had rarely admitted even to himself. "I believed order, even a harsh order, was preferable to the chaos that came before. I was raised on stories of the collapse, of the wars and the plagues. The consortium promised stability, security, A future. A future for who? Elian countered. For them. Not for the children they stole from the settlements. Not for us. I know, Kaelin said, the words a simple, heavy admission of guilt. My belief was a cage I built for myself. I did not see the bars until you showed them to me. He turned to look at Elian, and in the faint, chemical glow from the polluted water, his eyes were dark with a history of regret. The things I did to you, the sessions, the recalibration, there is no excuse for them. I was following orders, but that is not an absolution. It is a confession of cowardice. Elian felt the raw sincerity of the words through their connection, a wave of self-loathing so profound it made him ache in sympathy. The anger he had held onto for so long, the righteous fire of his betrayal, seemed to cool, leaving something softer, more complex in its place. You stopped, Elian said quietly. In the end, you made a different choice. That has to matter. Does it? Kaelin looked away, back at the desolate sea. It does not erase the harm done. No, Elian agreed. But it's where we start. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Kaelin's. The Alpha's hand was tense, but he didn't pull away. Elian gently took it, his smaller hand enfolding Kaelin's scarred knuckles. It was an act of forgiveness he hadn't known he was capable of. A fragile bridge built across a chasm of pain. Kaelin's breath shuddered, a barely perceptible crack in his iron control. He turned his hand, his fingers lacing with Elian's. Their palms met, a silent, profound contact. In that moment, the roles of Alpha and Omega, warden and prisoner, dissolved completely, leaving only two men, scarred and uncertain, finding a precarious solace in the ruins. They stayed like that for a long time, listening to the mournful song of the sea, their shared warmth a small, defiant outpost against the cold of the world. The data chip felt heavy in Kaelin's pocket, a constant reminder of the fight that still lay ahead. But for the first time, he did not feel like a soldier facing a battle. He felt like a man holding the hand of another, and in the quiet desolation of that poisoned shore, it felt like the only kind of victory that mattered. Their journey took them further into the wilds, to the borderlands where the consortium's reach was frayed and weak. They found refuge in a small, hidden community of outcasts and runaways, a pocket of resistance carved into the side of a mountain. It was a place of imperfection and life. There was dirt and noise and the vibrant, chaotic sense of cooking fires, growing things, and unsuppressed people. For Elian, it was a sensory paradise. He was no longer an anomaly. His empathy, once a classified weapon, became a gift. He could soothe a crying child without a word, sense a coming rockslide before it happened, help the community's healer diagnose illnesses by feeling the discord in a person's body. He began to smile, a real, unforced expression that transformed his face, erasing the haunted lines of the facility. He was healing. Kaelin's healing was a quieter, more difficult process. He was a man built for structure and purpose. And here, there were no orders to follow, no protocols to enforce. He was a weapon without a war. He kept to himself mostly, his disciplined presence a stark contrast to the community's easygoing nature. He maintained a silent, vigilant watch over their perimeter, his skills as a soldier finding a new, protective purpose. He watched Elian from a distance, saw him laugh with the children, saw the color return to his cheeks, saw him finally, truly breathe. And in those moments, Kaelin felt a complex mixture of relief and a profound, aching loneliness. He was the ghost of Elian's past, a living reminder of the trauma he had endured. He did not feel he had a place in this new, vibrant life Elian was building. One evening, Elian found him sharpening a knife by the light of a small fire, his movements precise and economical. The rest of the community was gathered in the main cavern, their songs and laughter echoing faintly. "You don't have to stand guard all the time," Elian said, sitting across the fire from him. "You're safe here." "Safety is an illusion," Kalen replied, not looking up from his work. "It is a state of preparedness." "Or maybe," Elian ventured, "it's a state of trust." He extended his hand, palm up, across the firelight. "I trust this place. I trust these people." Kalen stopped his work, his gaze lifting to meet Elian's. The firelight danced in his dark eyes. "They are good people, but they are not soldiers. They are not prepared for what the consortium will do to find that data chip." "Then we give it to them," Elian said simply. Kalen stared at him. "What?" "The chip. There's a network of rebels, people who can get that information out. The leader of this community, an old woman named Anya, she knows how to contact them. We give them the weapon, Kalen. We let them fight the war. We've done our part." The idea was both terrifying and liberating. For Kalen, the chip had become his purpose, his mission. To let it go felt like surrendering his only remaining identity. "Our part isn't done," he argued, his voice low. "They will hunt us. As long as we are alive, we are a threat to them. Loose ends." "Then we disappear," Elian said, his voice soft but firm. "There are places even the consortium can't reach. We can have a life, Kalen, a real one. Not running, not fighting, just living." He pushed a small, crudely carved wooden bird across the ground toward Kalen. One of the children had made it for him. "This is real. The sun on the rocks is real. That awful singing is real. The why we were fighting. It's this, isn't it?" Kalen looked at the small, imperfect bird. He looked at Elian's face, illuminated by the warm, flickering light, so open and full of a hope Kalen had never allowed himself to feel. He had spent his entire life in service of an idea, order, security, the mission. He had never considered what he would do after the war was won. He had never imagined a just living. The concept was alien. It was terrifying, and he wanted it more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. He reached out and picked up the wooden bird. Its rough texture was a grounding sensation in his palm. He looked at Elian, and for the first time he let the walls of the soldier, the warden, the alpha, crumble completely. He let Elian see the man beneath, the one who was lost and tired and desperately wanted to come home to a place he'd never known. "Yes," Kalen said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "It is." Later that night, they gave the data chip to Anya. A burden was lifted, a mission passed on. That night, for the first time, Kalen did not sleep by the entrance of their small cave, on guard. He lay down on the pallet of furs next to Elian. They didn't speak. They simply lay in the quiet darkness, close enough to feel each other's warmth, to hear each other's breath. In the shared silence, a new future began to take shape, not one of war and rebellion, but of quiet mornings and shared meals, of healing the scars they had given each other, and of finding out who they were when they were not just survivors. It was a fragile, uncertain peace, but it was theirs. And as sleep finally claimed him, Kalen's last conscious thought was of the simple, profound weight of the wooden bird in his hand, a symbol of a life he was finally, tentatively, allowing himself to choose.